Nobody asked Huawei for permission. Nobody sent a warning. One morning, the license simply expired, and the most powerful operating system on the planet was no longer available to one of the world's largest tech companies. Microsoft walked away. Washington made sure of it. And every analyst, every tech journalist, every geopolitical strategist said the same thing. Huawei is finished. They said a company cannot survive without Windows. They said you cannot build an operating system from scratch. They said it takes decades, billions, and a miracle. They were wrong on every single count. And what happened next is going to reshape the entire digital world. There's a moment in every great geopolitical power struggle where the aggressor makes a move so calculated, so precise, that the target has only two choices: collapse or evolve. In May 2019, Washington made that move against Huawei. The United States government added Huawei to its entity list, a designation that effectively cut the Chinese tech giant off from American technology. No more Google, no more Qualcomm, no more Intel, and eventually, inevitably, no more Microsoft Windows. The plan was elegant in its brutality. Strangle the software, kill the hardware pipeline, watch the company suffocate. What nobody in Washington planned for was what Huawei would do next. Because Huawei did not collapse. It did not beg. It did not pivot to selling cheaper phones in secondary markets and quietly disappear from the global conversation. Instead, it did something that no tech company in history had successfully done under these kinds of conditions. It built everything from scratch. A new chip, a new kernel, a new operating system, a new ecosystem. An entirely parallel digital universe that owes nothing to Silicon Valley, nothing to Redmond, Washington, and nothing to the United States government. And the most alarming part of this story, the part that mainstream media keeps glossing over, is that it is not just working, it is spreading. Harmony OS PC is the product of more than 10,000 engineers working across 20 research institutes, backed by over 2,700 core patents and 5 years of relentless internal development. Read that again. 10,000 engineers. Not a startup experiment, not a beta product rushed out of desperation. This is a full-stack, ground-up operating system designed to replace one of the most deeply entrenched pieces of software in the history of computing. And it was built under sanctions, under surveillance, and under enormous international pressure. The question is not whether Huawei built something remarkable. The question is why the world keeps acting like this is a minor story. To understand the full weight of what just happened, you have to go back to the beginning. Not 2019, but earlier. Much earlier. Harmony OS development began as early as 2012. Quietly, as a contingency plan, a backup strategy in case geopolitical tensions ever made Western technology inaccessible. That is the part that rarely gets mentioned. This was not a panic response. This was a calculated, decade-long preparation for a scenario that most people in the West assumed would never actually come. Huawei was building a lifeboat before anyone knew the ship was going to sink. And when Washington finally pulled the trigger in 2019, what looked from the outside like a catastrophic crisis was, in reality, the starting gun for a race that Huawei had already been running in secret for 7 years. But here is where it gets deeper. The sanctions did not just force Huawei to build its own operating system, they forced Huawei to build something arguably more dangerous. Genuine independence. Because every time you rely on someone else's operating system, you are not just licensing software. You are handing them a kill switch. You are building your entire digital infrastructure on a foundation that someone else controls, someone else can revoke, someone else can weaponize against you at a moment's notice. Washington understood this. That is why the sanctions were structured the way they were. What Washington did not account for was that Huawei understood this too, and had been quietly working to eliminate that vulnerability for years before anyone thought to use it against them. Huawei's license to use Microsoft Windows expired in March 2025, and the company cannot renew the agreement due to US sanctions. On the surface, that sounds like a corporate inconvenience. In reality, it is a civilizational fork in the road. March 2025 is the moment where a company that sells hundreds of millions of devices annually lost access to the operating system that powers over 70% of the world's personal computers. That is not a setback. That is an extinction-level event for any normal company. Huawei is not a normal company. 2 months after that license expired, Huawei debuted its first in-house operating system for personal computers, Harmony OS, running on its MateBook Fold, its latest foldable laptop. 2 months. The company went from losing Windows to shipping its own PC operating system in 60 days. Not because they figured it out in 60 days, because they had been ready for years. Think about what that means for the global balance of power and technology. For decades, the so-called Wintel Alliance, the partnership between Microsoft's Windows and Intel's processors, has been the invisible infrastructure of modern computing. It is the foundation on which governments run, on which corporations operate, on which militaries communicate. Microsoft and Intel did not just sell software and chips. They sold dependency. And dependency in geopolitics is leverage. Every government that runs Windows is, in some fundamental way, operating at the pleasure of Redmond, Washington. Every corporation that depends on Windows for its core workflows has handed a piece of its operational sovereignty to an American company, governed by American law, subject to American government pressure. For decades, nobody questioned this arrangement because there was no alternative. Now there is. Harmony OS PC rebuilds the operating system from the kernel up, achieving what Huawei describes as full-stack autonomy, a first for China's tech industry. And this is not marketing language. Full-stack autonomy means Huawei controls the chip, the kernel, the user interface, the security architecture, the app framework, and the AI layer. There's no single point where an American company or an American government order can reach in and shut things down. This is not just a technical achievement. This is a geopolitical weapon. Because whoever controls the stack controls the sovereignty of everyone who runs on that stack. But here is where it gets uncomfortable. Because the story does not stay in China. By late 2024, over 900 million devices were already running Harmony OS, with that number expected to cross the 1 billion mark soon. 1 billion devices. That is not a domestic product. That is a global ecosystem. And it is growing at a pace that should alarm every analyst who dismissed this as a China-only story. Harmony OS now commands 19% of the Chinese smartphone market, surpassing iOS to become the country's second-largest mobile platform, and has reached 5% global market share with over 1 billion active users. 5% global market share sounds small until you remember that Windows itself started from zero, until you remember that Android had almost no market share in 2007 and was running on 72% of the world's smartphones within 15 years. Ecosystems do not grow linearly, they grow exponentially, and then they dominate. By the first half of 2025, Huawei announced that its terminals have fully entered the Harmony OS era, with the total number of Harmony OS ecosystem devices approaching 1.2 billion. This is not a company that is surviving. This is a company that is thriving, and the operating system at the center of that ecosystem is no longer an experimental project. It is the backbone of one of the largest connected device networks on the planet. The scale of what Huawei has built quietly under sanctions, while the world watched and predicted its demise, is nothing short of extraordinary. And the implications of that scale are only beginning to become clear. Let us talk about the hardware for a moment, because the operating system is only half the story. Huawei's Kirin X90 is a groundbreaking ARM-based system-on-chip, designed to power Harmony OS-based PCs and laptops, developed by Huawei's HiSilicon division, aimed at replacing Intel and Qualcomm processors in Huawei's computing lineup. This is Huawei's answer to Apple's M-series chips, an in-house processor built specifically for in-house software, creating the kind of tight hardware-software integration that Apple spent a decade perfecting, and that the rest of the industry spent a decade trying to replicate. The Kirin X90 features a 10-core, 20-thread layout based on a custom ARM design, and analysts have described it as potentially Huawei's Apple Silicon moment. Apple Silicon, if you remember, was dismissed as a novelty when it launched in 2020. Within 2 years, it had forced Intel to completely rethink its roadmap and had made MacBooks the benchmark for laptop performance and efficiency. Huawei is attempting the same move, vertical integration of chip and OS, in a market where that combination has never existed before outside of Apple's ecosystem. And this is where everything changes. Because when you control the chip and the operating system, you do not just control the product. You control the experience, you control the security architecture, you control the data flow. Harmony OS PC includes Starshield architecture, which enforces full disk encryption at the chip level, meaning that even if the drive is physically removed, the data remains unreadable. That is not a consumer feature. That is an enterprise-grade, government-grade security proposition. That is the kind of security architecture that intelligence agencies demand and that enterprise IT departments have been asking Microsoft to deliver for years. And Huawei built it not as an add-on, not as a paid upgrade tier, but as a foundational layer of the operating system itself. Now consider the AI integration. Huawei's Zhaoyi AI assistant, powered by its Pangu and DeepSeek models, can generate templates, translate images, summarize meetings in real time, and offer system-level automation, more deeply embedded into the OS than Microsoft's Copilot, able to access system-level commands and UI elements through voice, image, or text. Microsoft has been selling Copilot as the future of Windows. Huawei just shipped a system where the AI is not a feature sitting on top of the operating system. It is woven into the operating system at the architecture level. Every function, every command, every workflow. The AI is not an add-on. It is the operating system. And that distinction matters enormously because it means that Harmony OS does not just compete with Windows on features. It competes on a fundamentally different design philosophy, one that may prove in the long run to be more powerful. But let us step back from the technical details for a moment, because the real story here is not about features and benchmarks. The real story is about what happens when the world's most populous country, the world's second largest economy, and one of the world's most aggressive tech sectors decides to build a complete, sovereign digital infrastructure from the ground up. In early 2025, Windows dominated China's PC market with an 80.18% share, while macOS lagged behind at 1.21%. That is the mountain that Harmony OS has to climb inside China alone, never mind globally. And yet, if you understand how Chinese government procurement works, how state-owned enterprises operate, and how Beijing has been systematically reducing its dependence on Western technology across every sector of its economy, you begin to understand that those numbers can shift faster than anyone outside China expects. As Windows 10's sunset approaches, with support ending October 2025, hundreds of millions of Asian users face hard choices. Many organizations cannot afford to upgrade hardware every 4 years, nor can they stomach the ballooning costs of Microsoft's extended security updates, now hovering around $30 per device per year, with no new features and complexity that is out of reach for many small businesses and individual users. This is the crack in the wall that Huawei is exploiting. Not by being technically superior in every metric, though Harmony OS is competitive in many areas, but by being present at exactly the moment when a massive segment of the Asian computing market is being forced to make a decision about its digital future. Windows 10 is dying. Windows 11 requires hardware that hundreds of millions of existing devices cannot meet. The upgrade path is expensive, confusing, and for many users in developing markets, genuinely out of reach. Harmony OS arrives at this exact moment as a credible, locally supported, aggressively priced alternative. And China's government has made its position unambiguous. Government support is massive. Shenzhen alone committed to deploying Harmony OS and related systems across 1 billion devices by 2025. Over 6.75 million registered developers are now building for the platform, 6.75 million developers. To put that in perspective, that is a developer ecosystem larger than many entire countries' tech workforce. And it is being directed, with government incentives, streamlined development kits, and favorable revenue sharing models, toward a single ecosystem, Harmony OS. When a government with China's capacity decides to treat an operating system as a matter of national security and economic sovereignty, the resources that flow toward that goal are not comparable to anything a private company can mobilize. This is not just a product strategy. This is a state-level infrastructure project. The geopolitical implications extend far beyond China's borders. Other nations are taking notice. India has developed Bar OS for high-security applications. Countries from Venezuela to Cuba have launched similar initiatives. China's success is proving that technological sovereignty, while difficult, is achievable with sufficient resources and strategic commitment. The narrative of Western technological dominance, the idea that you simply cannot build a credible alternative to Microsoft or Google or Apple, is crumbling in real time. And as it crumbles, governments around the world, particularly in the global south, are watching what Huawei has accomplished and asking a question they have never seriously asked before. Why are we dependent on American software for our critical national infrastructure? It is a question with no comfortable answer, and Harmony OS is, for many of those governments, the first plausible alternative that has ever existed. What most analysts are not seeing is the second-order effect of this shift. When Huawei offers governments in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America a complete technology stack, Huawei hardware, Harmony OS software, Huawei cloud services, Huawei telecommunications infrastructure, it is not just offering cheaper devices. It is offering a different geopolitical alignment. A country that builds its digital infrastructure on Huawei's stack is a country that no longer has a deep dependency relationship with American technology. And that changes the geopolitical calculus in ways that have nothing to do with operating systems and everything to do with power. Harmony OS's arrival marks a paradigm shift in the consumer tech landscape, a move toward multipolar digital ecosystems. Instead of a duopoly of US-based operating systems, we now witness the emergence of a Chinese origin OS with its own logic, principles, and user experience. The word multipolar is important here. For 30 years, the technology world has operated as a unipolar system. American platforms, American standards, American companies setting the rules for how the digital world works. That era is ending. Not because America is losing its technological edge. It is not. Not yet. But because the assumption that no viable alternative could exist has been shattered. Harmony OS is proof of concept. It is the existence proof that a complete, sovereign, competitive operating system ecosystem can be built outside the American tech orbit. And once that proof exists, the world will never look at Windows the same way again. Harmony OS PC currently supports more than 150 native PC apps and over 2,000 universal apps, most of which are optimized for Huawei's ecosystem. Critics will immediately point to this number, 2,000 apps versus the hundreds of thousands available on Windows, as the fatal flaw. And they are not entirely wrong. The app gap is real. It is the single biggest obstacle between Harmony OS and genuine mainstream adoption outside China. But this argument misses the nature of how people actually use computers. Study after study shows that the average knowledge worker uses fewer than a dozen applications for the vast majority of their work. Email, a web browser, a document editor, a spreadsheet, a presentation tool, a communication platform, a video conferencing application. Harmony OS has all of these. WPS Office, a fully functional Microsoft Office alternative developed in China, runs natively. WeChat, DingTalk, and Feishu cover collaboration and communication. The Harmony OS browser handles web applications. For the overwhelming majority of what most people do on a computer most of the time, Harmony OS is already a functional alternative. Harmony OS PC leans heavily on distributed computing. The idea that your phone, tablet, laptop, TV, and other Huawei devices can seamlessly share computing resources, files, clipboard content, and applications in real time. This is not a feature that Windows has. This is not a feature that macOS has in the same way. Apple's ecosystem integration is the closest comparison, but Apple's integration exists only within Apple's hardware universe. Harmony OS is building the same level of seamless cross-device integration across a device family that spans from budget, smartphones, to enterprise laptops, to automotive dashboards, to smart home systems. The vision is not just an operating system. The vision is a unified computing fabric that spans every screen in your life. And it is being built at scale that no other company in the world outside of Apple is anywhere close to achieving. Gesture control on Harmony OS PC supports 3-finger swipes, drag and drop multitasking, and screen splitting at the system level, UI elements designed with AI in mind, tightly woven into the system's operation. These are not the gestures of an operating system that is playing catch-up. These are the gestures of an operating system that is designing for a different future. A future where the distinction between mobile computing and desktop computing dissolves, where the operating system anticipates your workflow rather than reacting to it, where AI is not a chatbot you invoke, but an invisible layer that makes every interaction slightly more efficient, slightly more intelligent, slightly more personal. That future is where all operating systems are eventually going. The question is, which operating system gets there first and captures the loyalty of the next generation of users before anyone else does? Early adopters and industry testers describe Harmony OS Next as visually and functionally reminiscent of Windows 10, deliberately so. The goal is to lower friction by maintaining familiar metaphors: File Explorer, System Tray, right-click menus, and control panel styles that echo the Microsoft experience users are accustomed to. This is not an accident. This is a sophisticated adoption strategy. The hardest part of launching a new operating system is not building it. It is getting people to use it, because humans are creatures of habit, and the habits built around Windows over 3 decades run extraordinarily deep. By making Harmony OS feel familiar, by making the transition feel less like learning a new operating system and more like switching to a slightly different room in the same house, Huawei is dramatically lowering the psychological barrier to adoption. This is the same strategy that made Android successful against BlackBerry. It is the same strategy that made Windows successful against DOS. Meet users where they are, then take them somewhere new. Huawei is now reportedly preparing to launch a Harmony OS desktop PC in September 2026, targeting enterprise desktop environments, the deepest level of corporate computing infrastructure. This is the move that should concern Microsoft most. Consumer markets are recoverable, enterprise markets are not. When a company standardizes its entire desktop computing infrastructure on a new operating system, when it trains its IT staff on that system, when it builds its security protocols and deployment tools around that system, the switching cost becomes prohibitive within a few years. Enterprise lock-in is the most durable form of market dominance in the technology industry. It is the reason Windows survived the smartphone revolution, the cloud revolution, and every other disruption of the last 20 years. Huawei is going after enterprise computing in China with a domestic operating system backed by government procurement incentives, national security arguments, and a supply chain that cannot be cut off by American sanctions. If that effort succeeds, Microsoft will not just lose market share in China, it will lose an entire generation of enterprise customers who will never come back. In the second quarter of 2025, Huawei's mobile phones regained the top position in China's domestic smartphone market with a market share of 18.1%. The company that Washington tried to eliminate from the global technology landscape, using the most aggressive sanctions regime in the history of the tech industry, is now the #1 smartphone vendor in the world's largest smartphone market. That is not a comeback story, that is a repudiation. It is evidence that the sanctions strategy, while damaging, failed to achieve its ultimate objective, which was to make Huawei technologically irrelevant. Huawei is not irrelevant. Huawei is arguably more dangerous to American tech dominance today than it was before the sanctions, because now it has no dependency on American technology at all. The leash is gone, and a competitor with no leash is a fundamentally different kind of threat. Here's what nobody is saying out loud. The real risk to Microsoft is not that Harmony OS becomes the most popular operating system in the world tomorrow. The real risk is far more subtle and far more permanent. The real risk is that the global assumption, the background assumption that underlies every technology procurement decision made by every government and every corporation on the planet, shifts from, of course we use Windows, to why are we using Windows? That shift in assumption, once it begins, is almost impossible to reverse. And Harmony OS, by simply existing, by simply being functional, by simply being available as a credible alternative, has already triggered that shift in the minds of government officials in dozens of countries who are watching this story play out and asking themselves, for the first time, whether their digital sovereignty is something they actually control or something they have simply borrowed from an American company and assumed they would always be allowed to keep. China's operating system breakthrough demonstrates that the era of unquestioned Western technological dominance is ending. The success of Harmony OS proves that determined nations can develop competitive alternatives to established platforms, fundamentally altering global technology dynamics. This is not a Chinese government press release. This is the conclusion that independent technology analysts are reaching after examining the data. The data is unambiguous. 1 billion devices, 19% of China's smartphone market, a fully functional PC operating system built on a proprietary kernel, an enterprise desktop platform in development for 2026, an AI layer more deeply integrated than anything Microsoft has shipped. A chip designed specifically for that operating system, manufactured domestically, immune to American export controls. Every single piece of the stack, from the silicon to the AI model, built and controlled by a single company in a single country, answerable to a single government. This is not chaos, this is strategy. This is a decade-long, meticulously executed plan to build a complete technological civilization that owes nothing to the West. And it is further along than almost anyone in Washington, Brussels, or Tokyo is willing to publicly admit. The comfortable narrative that Huawei is a damaged company limping along on domestic subsidies, that Harmony OS is a hobbyist project that will never challenge Windows, that Chinese technology is derivative and incapable of genuine innovation, is not just wrong. It is dangerously wrong. It is the kind of wrong that leads to strategic miscalculation, and strategic miscalculation in a technology Cold War has consequences that play out over decades. The spreading of Harmony OS is the story, not its launch, not its technical specifications, not whether it can run Adobe Photoshop. The spreading, across 1 billion devices, across government procurement systems, across developer communities, across the minds of technology policymakers in 50 countries who are watching China demonstrate that sovereign technology is possible. That is what matters. Because every new device that runs Harmony OS is a device that does not run Windows. Every developer who builds for Harmony OS is a developer who's not building for Windows. Every government that deploys Harmony OS and its agencies is a government that has reduced its dependency on American software. These are not large numbers yet, but they are growing numbers. And in ecosystems, growth is everything. The question that nobody in the industry wants to answer is this: what happens when Harmony OS crosses 10% of the global PC market? What happens when the developer community reaches critical mass? What happens when the enterprises that adopted it in China begin exporting that infrastructure to subsidiaries in other countries? What happens when the governments that have been watching from the sidelines decide that the moment has come to make their move toward digital sovereignty, and Harmony OS is the only credible option on the table that is not American? What happens when the assumption shifts? What happens when the world wakes up one morning and realizes that the digital infrastructure it built its modern civilization on is no longer a monopoly? That there is another stack, a parallel stack, a 1 billion device stack, running quietly in the background, spreading, growing, waiting. Washington made a choice when it added Huawei to the entity list. It chose to use technology as a weapon. What it failed to anticipate is that the target of that weapon would spend 6 years forging its own arsenal. Harmony OS is that arsenal, and it is already in the hands of more people than most of the world realizes. The story of what Huawei just built is not the story of a company surviving a crisis. It is the story of a civilization deciding to stop depending on another civilization for the tools it needs to function. That story is not over. It has barely begun. And the next chapter, the chapter where this technology leaves China's borders and begins reshaping the digital infrastructure of the developing world, one government deployment at a time, may well be the most consequential chapter in the history of computing since Bill Gates convinced IBM to let him own the operating system. The difference is that this time, the person who owns the operating system is not selling it to you. They are giving it to you. And what they want in return is something far more valuable than money.